do my little kind of, there you go, welcome. So we're formally making a start. So I'm calling today the re-evaluation game. It's kind of it's got the word "ation" on the end, so it's a bit like the generation game. We're going to see sometimes you're going to see a couple of times the word repent in the English text, but the Greek word is slightly different from repent. It's much more to do with re-evaluating. But as many of you will be aware, when we translate the word repent, the Greek root is to think again, to think beyond, to think deeper. So it's kind of got a re-evaluation sense in it. But the actual Greek word, which I now can't remember, it's another meta. It's a metamelanon or something. I can't remember now. It's about re-evaluating, kind of rethinking after the event, having your opinion challenged. That you should have your opinion challenged, but it's okay if your opinion's been challenged and you change your mind. That's a good thing to do. It's part of the focus of it. And so there are kind of a couple of elements to the verses we're going to look at, which, as I said, if I go back, we're looking at 9 verses, so Matthew 21, verses 23 up to 32. So we're starting off now. If you remember, as we were looking last week, we had a kind of a joining section within Matthew where he recounts what's happened to the fig tree, but he kind of recounts it in the middle of the process by which Jesus has cleared the temple traders, and before that he's ridden into Jerusalem on the donkey, and there's a huge amount of kind of prophetic inflow into those events. Jesus is kind of deliberately acting out, kind of stepping forwards and generating conversation amongst people who are coming up to the temple for the Passover, who are used to discussing when the Messiah might come, and therefore will be much more aware of some of the rabbinic ideas and thoughts that had gone into understanding certain prophetic verses. And Jesus has, in many ways, kind of deliberately triggered things within their own minds by the way he's acted out over the last few days, by riding in on the donkey, turning over the money traders, and so on. So, as I said, this is a slightly simpler passage now, as Jesus is now coming into the temple. So this is now on Tuesday morning of Holy Week. And if you've done the kind of walk through Holy Week or walk through Jesus last year, I sometimes refer to this as Tag Team Tuesday because there's an awful lot of backwards and forwards going on between the temple authorities and the huge kind of entourage that is beginning to gather around Jesus, which means that he can't be dealt with in the usual way. The usual way that troublemakers are dealt with within the temple is the temple guard. We read in the rabbinic writings how they carry sticks around with them to kind of give people a bit of a slap and chuck them out, which is exactly, of course, what had happened to Jesus the first time he cleared the temple traders. But that can't be done this time. And as we put the kind of Gospels together, we actually see, and we've heard how that Jesus is really on the Monday has been in control of the narrative of what's being discussed, what's being talked about. And so there's obviously been some level of consolidation. It talks about them beginning to plot against Jesus. And so Jesus is coming in on the Tuesday morning. As he gets into the temple, there's a little bit more preparation. It's not going to be too overt, but what we'll see is we have question after question come into Jesus. Now we're just going to look at really the initial phase of this backwards and forwards that goes on, and the temple authorities, in one sense, looking to set an agenda for Jesus to say things which they can then use against him. So once he'd come into the temple, the senior priests and the elders of the people came to him while teaching. So the senior priests, we often see chief priests. You could translate it as high priests. The reason they translators often put chief priests is because they think it can be either, and they think it's probably wider. And in that context, what we're talking about is that the The family of Annas actually occupy a large number of priestly positions, which is why after Annas was deposed by the Romans as the high priest, he has a run of 5 sons and his son-in-law, who kind of then take on the high priestship. But they're all within the system already. They're already acting as senior priests. So that kind of idea. So there's this little kind of unofficial, they don't have official status. They're not the high priest. They're not even the slightly confused situation that we have at this period of time where there was a high priest who hasn't died, but the Romans have deposed him, so we have other high priests alongside. So you have 2 high priests at the moment. So they're not part of that, they're part of this wider clientele. So it's those guys, and the elders of the people here is probably a reference to the slightly extended Sanhedrin that met. So there's the Sanhedrin itself, which is kind of supposedly 70 to 72 group, but the positions within that are maintained by the powerful families, and so there's probably a sense in which there are kind of, again, edge people, hangers on, who slightly bulk out that kind of core group, to be referred to as the elders of the people. So those are the folks, and it says when they're the ones who come, and although we're not looking at it today, we'll see various representative groups kind of come up with various questions during Tuesday to put to Jesus, to look to try and entrap him and so on. But the overarching question as they first come in is, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? It's certainly none of them. And between the two groups, we're covering all of the standard kind of places where there is an accepted credibility and so on. So Jesus answered them saying, so I'll also ask you something. The also there, I think, is the word and, but it plays a kind of a role that extends the process. So I will ask you something, but is I will ask you and something. It's that kind of approach. So I'm going to ask you something, which if you answer me, I will likewise tell you by what authority I do these things. And so we this is one of those verses that loads of people know, because even probably those who aren't that serious with their faith, it's a kind of a good illustration of Jesus's sort of debating, if that's the right word, or kind of his engagement approach with the other authorities, the Pharisees and so on, which is a kind of a left field response. So he doesn't answer his questioners on their terms. Where's the authority from? He kind of takes a step back and tries to point out to everybody, and does so successfully, that the question is ingenuous. With his statement of why do you do these things, despite having an example from Jesus of the fact that very often there are questions and points being made that have a context to them that is perhaps unstated by folks, and that a more honest thing to do would be to state our assumptions and state our position. It's incredibly common to see theological debates, both within Christendom, but equally kind of interfaith dialogues, where there's an awful lot of unspoken, but everybody is aware of it, context to certain questions. And it just kind of it highlights in many ways to me the need to develop within our own kind of church context a kind of an approach to asking questions. It's a challenge because sometimes people can see the thing of, well, we're not about asking questions, we're about faith, and we want to be submitted to the Word of God and to so on and so forth. But often what we try and do is we slip in a lot of assumptions into the way we frame things. So it's a nice little example of Jesus kind of highlighting that that's going on and saying it's not worth having conversations on these terms. If I was, I probably should have tried to think earlier of some good examples of that. I'm kind of aware of being frustrated oftentimes when you see people making points and thinking, I know there's another agenda here, but how do you kind of draw it out? And I can't now think of a good example that wouldn't be too rude. And I don't want to do that necessarily. I'm just trying to say we need to be ourselves people who practice a sense of saying, look, we all come from a particular position. We all see things in certain ways. Let's be honest and put those things out. But then we can discuss and work things forwards. But in this context, the issue is to try and give Jesus a question that actually there can be a lot of confusion created around it by where does this authority come from? Is Jesus saying something that is too much for some people to hear right now? That's a real possibility. Jesus doesn't instantly articulate right from the very beginning of his ministry who he is. As time goes on, it becomes easier to say that with more clarity to more people. But even at this stage, the truth of who Jesus is would be too much for most people who are going to hear him. It would probably be quite a shock, even if he said it quite so plainly to even some of his own disciples. The Lord is very, very generous to us in that there are certain things he wants us to discover for ourselves rather than to tell us and demand, if you like, the faith in what he's just said. And so in actual fact, there's something important to kind of hear in that. The process by which we get to know something is very often a really good marker as to how deep it's going to go in us. If we've started to comprehend something that we've not been forced to see, we tend to own it much more internally. It becomes more part of who we are. So one of the things I regularly do, so Joseph, I haven't even worked out, but I might be doing this evening when we when we meet as a church. Is I kind of I take people through a little bit of a process with some kind of visual illusions, and you get people to work out where they can. Some people can see them, some can't. And some people just kind of will say what they are and people hear what they are. And then you try and take people through a process where those who can't see something, instead of telling them what it is, you kind of create an environment where you kind of get them to look at the thing in different ways. And almost universally, it's one of those just things is when someone suddenly sees it, they actually have an emotional jump. It's almost a joy jump. And they go, oh, I can see it now. And then they get very excited. and you can kind of capture that moment. There's a kind of a sense in which this now is something I've got my head around. So now I see it. And so there is a sense in which Jesus is being pushed to say something up front, which would be true, 100% true, but isn't necessarily winning people on the journey into that place of discipleship with him. The excitement of actually unpacking the truths of God together in those moments. And so, Jesus answers in that way that's very kind of clever as we think about it. I'll ask you something, which if you answer me like that, likewise, I'll tell you with what authority I do these things. So let's think about it. The baptism of John, where was it from? Is it heaven or humanity? Technically, the Greek there has got the word from twice, from heaven or from people or from men. But I just kind of, I'm a sucker for alliteration. So I've kind of gone for heaven or humanity. Whereas it's the right kind of sense, is it divine or is it just kind of a good idea? Now, they reasoned amongst themselves, a little kind of comment, saying, now, if we say from heaven, he's going to ask, so why didn't you have faith in him? Again, having faith or believing is translating the same Greek word. But we often reserve having faith for Jesus, but I just thought it's worthwhile seeing it. Why didn't you then, when John came and spoke, you didn't respond? You're the people, as the authorities. There were plenty of lower level Pharisees who did respond to John, and so we are talking about this senior cabal, the chief priests, the elders of the people, for whom John had come with a message, and it is convenient just to ignore it. Kind of, that's for the commoners, that's the popularist opinion. We're a bit smarter than that. And so they've played that kind of role. But now Jesus is pushing the question back to them. So why don't you tell us exactly where you stand on this? So is it from heaven? So then they're going to say, so then why didn't you have faith in him? Why didn't you respond and do the things he was saying you ought to respond and do stuff with? But if we say it's from humans, Well, then we fear the multitude, because everyone holds John as a prophet. And sorry, I'm just going to throw these. The power of what a community believes is an incredibly powerful thing, both for good and for ill. It's something that kind of multiplies small moments. So once someone starts to get faith, if for instance, let's take that, you have a situation, you've got a community, and you pray together for somebody, you lay hands on them and they get healed, and faith kind of grows in the community, and the community bolsters that faith, and things very often can spiral up quite quickly. So then people have a bit more faith to pray with a bit more conviction the next time, and somebody else gets healed, and it kind of grows layer by layer. The flip side is if something doesn't go the way people prayed, and it's not well processed within a church, the negative can kind of come in, or within a wider culture. Once people start to get cynical of leadership, they become cynical of all leaders. And actually, as they become cynical of all leaders, they themselves become unleadable. And yet, actually, in our humanity, God has made us to look to follow. We have a desire in us to both follow people that are trustworthy and to be followed by others that find us trustworthy. So once we become too cynical and it becomes a cultural norm, you find that actually the implications spread very, very fast. And now on this occasion, what they're noticing is people will have different views on John, but what they all agree is he was a real prophet, and what he said had truth to it. And we've tried to respond to it in different ways and at different levels, but we all agree he was a prophet. Now, if he was a prophet, we should have done something. But in fact, we did nothing, because we were playing the long game. That's the way that leaders often do. They kind of stand back from it. and so Jesus is able to kind of draw out. There's assumptions that they're making there. They're playing the long game. They are wanting people to recognize their authority by not being too certain on things. And in a certain way, that's true of Jesus too. He's, as I said, he's wanting people to come into a personal revelation of who he is, not impose on them at this key moment all truth about what it means to be both divine and human at the same time, and so on. So they answered Jesus and said, "We don't know." And he responded, "So neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." And then we get the first of a run of different parables, but this one is very related to the things that have just happened. So now, says Jesus, "Now what do you think?" So a man had 2 sons, and coming to the first, he said, "Son, go to work today in the vineyard." But answering, he said, "I will not." Afterwards, however, having reconsidered, he went. So here's the reevaluation, you see. That actually, so there are 2 things. It's not just, as we're going to see, it's not just that some people that seem bad at first become good, and it's where they end up ultimately, but it's also the ability to reconsider. That I think is part of what Jesus is driving at, to not get so entrenched in our position that we can't be changed in the light of new evidence. So then he came to the second and said the same thing, and he answered, "Absolutely, sir." The words "I will" aren't there. It's just a "yes, sir." Is what the Greek actually said. So he said, "Absolutely, sir," but he didn't go. And so we're getting this kind of, again, another kind of very human contrast between the things we express and the things we do that aren't always the same. Some of you will be aware of, I do kind of areas of coaching occasionally. Don't do so much of it now as I used to. With that extend outside of the church, and so not everyone there has faith. So you kind of work with the best of modern psychological research, which has a very good fit with Christian revelation, which shouldn't surprise us, as people try and understand the actual way our brains work and why we do things the way we do. But one of the interesting little kind of discoveries, or confirmations, it should be said, is that very often people who speak the most about being good are more likely to have a problem actually doing it. And yet we live in a culture that loves to virtue signal. So what does that tell us? It tells us we feel much better talking about doing good things than we are actually at doing them. And so it's almost kind of, it is a little bit, it's the lady doth protest too much type of syndrome, which is that, but that when we talk a lot about, I want to do a lot about climate change, the reality is that we don't really understand it. It's just what the crowd does. If the crowd is into this, we do it. So a good example of this, for instance, would be, again, it's going to sound like I'm being political, and I'm not wanting to be political, but loads of councils, for instance, will ask you now to wash out your recycling, you see. So, but the reality is, and we're recycling because we want to be environmentally friendly, but it takes more energy for every individual to go and wash out their tins and cans and then put them in a thing and send them off than it would be if the council collected everything up and then took it down to steam clean the whole lot together. So what you guess is that while the badges be green, be environmental, the reality is we've got a budget to do it, and if we can get you to pay for it by washing them yourselves, then that's all good, even though in actual fact it uses more energy than if we did it. Now that kind of hypocrisy is just kind of endemic within human nature, because we feel good about ourselves when we talk about doing the right thing and talk in those terms. But it's important kind of in this mix to kind of recognize that there needs to be a kind of a confirmation between who we are and what we do. And Jesus also gives an emphasis to say that those who may initially not seem to be that helpful, if they're willing to reconsider things, if they're willing to kind of wait on evidence, they're the ones that seem to get blessed in this, or get affirmed in this particular parable. And again, I just kind of throw it out there as an approach that to not critical thinking is not a cynical spirit. So critical thinking can sometimes be cautious when it looks at what's going on. But not so that it's not so that it can ignore it, but so that it can be clear that it really is what it claims to be. And I do think there is it's not, if you like, it's not a big moral issue within a church, but we want to kind of develop a sense of, if truth is truth, we needn't defend things that aren't. And so, and in doing so, then we become more discerning, which means we tend to be wiser. And I think that kind of wisdom often allows the moves of God to become more sustainable. And this is a personal opinion, so I'm not teaching this now as biblical teaching. I'm teaching, and I'm kind of saying I see verses like this speaking to it. So as I say, what it's speaking to is, I hear a story of a miracle. I'm not cynical of that, but I want to know exactly what the miracle was. And when you do, sometimes you recognise it is a miracle, but it's not always the one that's been claimed that has happened. And the problem is, while it's sometimes easier to think and to go for the thing that was claimed, then suddenly at some point it doesn't look. Suddenly people see it isn't quite the way it is, and the mass then says, no, it wasn't a miracle, and so the whole group has suddenly flipped from we were all in it with faith together, now we're all out of it with faith. And here we see, if you like, these small choices and decisions, once they get into the crowd, they can tip one way or the other. So particularly for those who are in areas of community responsibility and leadership, and I know from an exegetical point of view, I'm pushing this way outside of where the text really goes, but I think it's interesting that we have presented those who are supposedly responsible for the community, the senior elders, the senior priests, and they're responding to the question that Jesus asks them, thinking about the fact, but the masses think this. We recognize the power of what they think. We try and control those things. We recognize that that's something we manage by the way we present stuff and what we encourage and what we don't. But history can turn on those kind of contagions of what we believe or don't believe in. And so a part of the kind of the wisdom of leadership is to try and stay critical without becoming cynical, to make sure we really understand what's going on. Because often things are a miracle, but they're just not quite as big. And what I'll do is I'll leave you to ask the questions if you want, to try and give you examples of, rather than go too fast and say and be too provocative in trying to highlight those things. Well, I'll tell you what. No, I can be a little bit more safe because they're people I know. But I remember sitting down with the Arnott's some years back and talking to them and about the early days, and they are very candid about the fact that they didn't have much wisdom, because nobody really did when things started to happen around Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship. And with hindsight and now with the experience they've got over the years, if you went back, there were things that they would have done differently to the way they did. But that is, if you like, the way we often learn. And so they were probably worth, when people looked in and said, well, there's probably some stuff going on that's demonic over there, they would look back and say, now we would look back and say, yeah, there probably was. But the thing was, God was doing stuff that God was in and was so different, we couldn't always tell, we weren't always sure what we were supposed to do with it. And yet there are, obviously out of that experience, out of the lack of wisdom, which I'm not criticising them for having, because I think it would have been complicated. It's always complicated when God does something new. You're desperately trying to get your hands around exactly what it is He's doing. To come with a kind of a critical approach, to really work out, okay, what is He doing? How's He done it? That's a much more, for me, if we can try and do it, we will never be perfect at it. We try and do it. We create a safer community, and it's easier to establish the community in real faith in what it is that God has really done. Anyway, these are a bit, as I say, personal opinions really, rather than biblical teaching, so I do apologise today. So he came to second, he said the same thing and answered, absolutely, sir, but he didn't go. And then Jesus kind of really draws it home to those who have come with the question. So which of the two did the will of the Father? So they answered the first. So he's pushed it back to them. So we all know that in the end, the ones that did it, the one that did the will of the Father was the one that went, even though they seemed to have the wrong attitude to start with. So Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. It's not just that they will, but they are right now. And some of that, you see, he is referring to the fact that those are the people who responded to the preaching of John. So we've been thinking about John. Where did his where was his message from? So they recognised it, even though they were in a place where they weren't honouring God by the keeping of a covenant. But perhaps there were reasons why, because when they looked at the way, there was something in them that looked at the way that God was supposed to be honoured by the religious keeping of the covenant through the religious systems, and it didn't quite make sense to them. But they were willing to reconsider it when they saw somebody who looked more prophetic, who looked much more like the Old Testament prophets, who looked much more like the way God spoke when he was active. So they were willing to consider their own behaviours and their whole lives in response to that, and abandon, if you like, the cynicism that they had towards religious observance, which had grown out of the kind of the mass being presented with something and being driven towards accepting something as being of God and being the way to do things. But then John had come along and it had made them reappraise. This is just an observational thing, but I think that's you often find a very similar thing in various stories about revival. Is that it's not that everything that's happening is something that is ultimately long-term good, but when the very fact that God is acting, he's surprising us. If he's not surprising us, then it's probably not God acting. And that surprise requires a kind of a critical approach, not a cynical one, but one that kind of is trying to weigh its way forwards. So, just in the US at the moment, they've released this story of the Jesus Revolution. And some of you will be aware of some of the characters, and they were very, very flawed in the mix. And then there's a lot of controversy now about the fact they made a film because one of the key characters, Lonnie Donegan, who died of AIDS, but he'd come from a sexually abusive background, and it's now kind of come out much more clearly for those who knew him that it wasn't contracted because of him falling. He did fall away from the law, but he didn't go back to his homosexual lifestyle. But actually, in that context, a lot of that just wasn't something that was known. But I heard it regularly as a critique of what God did during that period. And yet the reality is almost every safe church in the country now has kind of styles of worship that came out of that move of God. So whether you liked it or not, the truth is it's changed the church and for the better, with all of its messiness. But actually, here's a kind of a good example. So people who had nothing to do with church were suddenly, the hippies, were suddenly coming into fellowship, and because of the work that was going on there, for those who just wanted to stand back and be critical, those who wanted to stand back and be cynical, you can always take that place. Equally, for those that came in and didn't have any critiquing going on at all, there were some messy things that happened and some things that would have been better if they hadn't happened. But actually, there is a kind of a considered critique that has actually produced something really fruitful, I believe, that's kind of gone right the way through the church, right the way around the world. So this wasn't the way I was intending to do this. It's turned out to more of a preach than a teach. So I do apologise. We'll do the last verse. For John came to you in the normal form of righteousness. Jesus uses the phrase the way of righteousness, the road of righteousness. But in other words, he came to you in the way you expect the righteous to appear. And actually, that is the average person, the way the average person looked at things. He looks like Elijah, for instance, and I've read about Elijah. I get frustrated and I'm a bit critical and cynical about the religion around the temple that we've got at the moment. So he comes looking like that, but you didn't trust him. The masses did, but you didn't. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes had faith in him. Then, having seen this, having seen that they were having faith, you didn't recognise, as Jesus has taught before, you know a tree by its fruit. You should have said, looking at it. And that's always one of my responses to those who are stubbornly critical of what happened, say, for instance, through Toronto. People say, well, where's the fruit? Well, the fruit is literally hundreds of thousands of churches across the world, well, tens of thousands at least. You can measure that in Mozambique. The story of the explosion of Iris Ministries across that region all ties back to them coming along to the Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship at a time where they were almost giving up being missionaries and getting touched by the Holy Spirit and going back. That's the fruit. There is real fruit. We can have questions about some of the mess that's happening in the mix. But actually, if that becomes, if you like, if that critique becomes something cynical, then we miss something that God is doing. And so my kind of encouragement almost always is I want to be open. But a bit like when Paul says about tongues, if I pray with my tongues and I pray with tongues more than the most of you, I want to also pray with my mind. Because my mind is a gift that God's given me, just as tongues is a gift that God has given me, and somehow I want to approach it with faith, but understanding what's really going on. If I do that, then we're more likely to walk forwards with the best of what God's got for us. Whereas we do one of the other two. Okay, there are flaws if we just take everything without consideration. There are flaws if we allow our considerations to stop us from actually receiving, which is what's going on here. So his challenge is then, having seen this, you didn't even reevaluate with hindsight to believe him, which is the challenge that should have been there. So that's my kind of, if you like, preach based on this passage this morning. Does anyone want to ask any questions or clarify anything or challenge anything or think about some of those messy situations which we look at, and how do we approach them with real faith?